Everyone from my side as well, and thank you very much, Laura, for the invitation and also for the kind words and the kind introduction already. As you said, I can maybe say a few words to my own background. Of course, we're both also very happy to be here and to share our CSR strategy and our sustainability innovation approach from Camelot with you and to discuss it with you. But yeah, maybe some words to myself. So what is a bit funny, Laura just said that she was talking to Marisa 2 years ago when everything began with the CSR strategy at Camelot, and that's actually also when my journey at Camelot began, and also due to the CSR lecture and due to Laura, because I saw the job actually posted on the CSR page or on the it was posted by Laura, I think. So that's how I came to Camelot, and I also took this lecture 3 years ago maybe. And I studied for 7 years at the University of Mannheim, so it's really nice for me now to be here on the other, maybe a little bit on the other side, because I finished my studies last year. And yeah, the CSR lecture inspired me a lot to deep dive more into the topic of CSR, and yeah, it's one of the reasons why I'm doing this job now. So I'm very happy about that. But yeah, let's get started with what we want to talk about today. Of course, as we just said, we don't want to overwhelm you today with a lot of input and information from our side, but have a lot of room and space for discussion and questions at the end. So we just have a very rough and short agenda, which is shown here now. So I will start talking a little bit of about our general and overall CSR strategy at Camelot, and before that I will just also introduce Camelot quickly. I don't know what Laura already explained to you before, but just a few words on the company, and then I will hand over to Thomas, who will give you some insights about the sustainability innovation regarding value chain management at Camelot. And yeah, with that we can already start, because Camelot is a consultancy company with a focus on value chain, so on value chain management. We're value chain experts, and although our headquarters are in Mannheim, so we are quite regional based company, we are operating on a global level as well, and we have over 20 years, well, obviously not me myself, but the company has over 20 years experience in value chain consulting now. Actually, it's exactly 25 years this year, so we're celebrating 25 years of Camelot this year, and our whole network of consultants and employees in general counts about 1,800 employees globally, who are working on processes and technology to develop solutions for our clients. And we have clients in very different business fields, so for example, life sciences, but also chemicals and consumer goods or industrial manufacturing, and many of them are also part of the Fortune 500 companies. So we have managed to create some great business value together with them for their companies in the past 25 years. And we are doing this with an end-to-end approach, which is very important for us. So meaning we aim to deliver from strategy to solutions, meaning that we offer a holistic consulting portfolio for value chain management. And I do not want to go into detail about all these elements and parts of the whole value chain. You can see that here on the bottom of this slide. But what is maybe interesting is that the Camelot group itself, as a consulting company, as a group, is split into two companies again. So we have the management consultants on the one hand side and the IT lab on the other hand side. And we have therefore experts for both, for the management part, for the more strategic process related part, from the management consultant perspective. And then we also have the innovations from part of the technology side, meaning that we're also cooperating with some of the leading software providers such as SAP and IBM, and are more focusing on data-centric and digital business solutions. And that's all I want to say about the company itself, about Camelot as a company. So yeah, let's start talking about CSR. As we already heard before, it's still quite a young approach at Camelot. So we started addressing the topic of CSR in 2019. And when we start talking about CSR at Camelot, we usually start with phases. So as Laura said before, and as also I highlighted, what is very important for us is this community approach. So basically, this means, of course, we have management support, and management drive in and are closely connected and in touch with our management. But actually, all the actions and activities which are started at Camelot regarding CSR are coming from a community. So we try to include all Camelots into our CSR strategy. So for example, as you can see here on the slide, in 2019 and 20, together we managed to realize and to implement around about 10 initiatives, and they were all driven by our colleagues. And we also call them CSR ambassadors, as we are convinced that actually our colleagues, our whole group of employees, has the most power for spreading and sharing the spirit of CSR within the company. And we are therefore also very proud that now we have more than 200 people already in our CSR community who are driving these actions and who are supporting us. And when I'm talking about us, I mean the CSR Council. So we don't have like a huge department for CSR or something, which you could maybe think if you see all those faces. It's more a CSR Council, how we call it. And that's me and 3 colleagues. And we are more in charge of the general thing. Like, we try to come up with a strategy. We try to support the whole CSR actions, to give some guidance, and to be kind of the connection between the management board and the whole company, like the base, which is then driving and supporting our CSR approaches. So when talking about our strategy, we can flip to the next slide maybe. Exactly. We try to connect both our core company values as well as global guidelines and international guidelines. So on this slide, you can see that we try to map the UN Sustainable Development Goals with the 3 pillars of responsibility, so society, environment, and economy, and our Camelot core values. So let me quickly explain you that in a bit more detail. So our core values are people, innovation, quality, and responsibility. And we try to just see which of the sustainable developments are the most important for us as a company. Where can we deliver value? Where can we actually drive something? Where can we contribute to achieving those global goals on our company level? And then we try to also map that to the 3 pillars of society, environment, and economy. And we then also defined buckets within these 3 responsibility pillars, which are based on our company values and with which we try to contribute to those specific SDGs. So Thomas, if you flip to the next slide, exactly. For example, we have 1 bucket for social responsibility, 1 for environmental responsibility, and 1 for economic responsibility, where we try to map all our activities. So for example, in the part of social responsibility, we would put diversity and inclusion, which means we want to foster our diversity and inclusion management, our diversity and inclusion actions internally, so within the company. But we also want to contribute to societies, or want to support societies externally, for example, through our social sabbatical projects, which we're offering for our employees, so they can engage in social projects and social organizations during their social sabbatical. Then as the second pillar, we have our environmental responsibility actions, which cover topics such as mobility or waste management, energy management, but also the general topic of carbon emission reductions, which I will be talking a little bit more in detail about later on. And then the third one, our economically responsible business practices, which will cover then also the topics Thomas will be talking about later on. So the green, so-called green projects, where we just try to achieve value, to achieve impact through our business activities. And now I want to just give you some examples, to have some more details for you. So for example, as I said, we focus also on diversity and inclusion. And one of the actions we are doing there is the diversity challenge currently. So 2 years ago, also when we started with the whole CSR approach, Camelot as a company signed the Diversity Charta. This was developed by an employer initiative. And yeah, we as a company, of course, also want to support this and therefore signed this Charta. And the Charta provides several diversity dimensions. You can see them here on the slide as well. So it's about religion and worldview, gender, sexual orientation, identity, ethnic origin, nationality, age, and physical and mental ability. And I think they just recently in January added also the socioeconomic background, which is quite important also in my opinion. So I'm quite happy that this was added as well. So we try to focus our overall diversity management at Camelot as well on those pillars, because also if you think about diversity and inclusion, often people think about gender and maybe also about nationality, but some of the other aspects are quite often overlooked. So we try to incorporate them all. And what we are doing with the challenge right now is we formed a team consisting of 7 young employees. Actually, a funny side fact, I don't really know why, but it had to be people younger than 27, so I'm luckily still in there. And we are currently trying to develop an activity or to just make diversity more visible and to contribute to a higher level of living diversity at Camelot in general. So as a first step, we did an internal survey, which we conducted at the end of last year at 2020, and we just recently finished analyzing all the results and also published that internally. So one very important point for us in diversity, but in the whole CSR strategy, is also transparency. We would really want to make transparent everything we do, so every Camelot can check what are we doing, what are we improving, and what do we want to achieve with that. And yeah, that's the current status for that. Then the second example I want to give to you goes into the direction of responsible projects. So this also is an example of 2019, which is a bit due to Corona, of course. You can see here in the picture that there was times where we could still meet in person somewhere. So yeah, that was an event called Climathon. So it was a hackathon event where Camelot took part, and we actually handed in or set up a task. So there was a challenge idea coming from Camelot around circular economy, and there were several student groups involved, which where the students could apply for one of the tasks and then develop a solution for these tasks. And on the day itself, where the hackathon took place, we had some consultants there who also supported the student teams with their idea development. And I think here in the picture you can see it was quite successful. I think the team, or one of the teams who took our challenge, actually won this Climathon. So that was nice for us as well, and we're still following up with their approaches there. And then last but not least, the last example I want to give to you is our CO2 emission reduction action. So this is a very recent project we started at Camelot, and Thomas and I are both part of this project. So our goal is to come up with a carbon emission reduction plan. So we calculated our carbon emission footprint for 2019. Of course, there are quite some differences for 2019 compared to 20 and 21 due to the Corona situation, as of course we as a consulting company do travel a lot and did not travel a lot this year and last year. But yeah, we will of course consider that in our planning. And yeah, our current status is we are doing brainstorming sessions, again involving everyone who's interested. So based on our footprint analysis and on what we know, what we are doing as a company, we did some brainstorming sessions to come up with realizable, with feasible, but also with impactful measures how to reduce our footprint. And we're currently now just consolidating them, and we'll try then to make this a good plan for the future, so we can reduce our carbon emissions. And this is actually the point where I would like to hand over then to Thomas. So stage is yours.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Kati. Yeah, and actually we just discussed yesterday 3 hours in the team, our carbon footprint measures. I think the team came up in like 5 different workshops with more than 100 ideas, and we were kind of prioritizing them. So I think it's really a great community spirit, right, to drive this home together. Yeah, quickly about me. Who am I? I'm Thomas Ebel. I'm a partner at Camelot. I'm consulting clients around value chain strategy and optimization. And I also lead our sustainable consulting offerings. Yeah. So basically, what's my background? I've been working for 25 years, helping companies optimize their supply chain, optimize their procurement. I've been with Karstadt Quelle in procurement for a long time. I've been with McKinsey in operations consulting, and I'm now since 2 years with Camelot. Yeah, so what's my link with sustainability? Yeah, so my background is I'm not coming from the sustainability angle. I'm more coming from the business and supply chain angle. And that's really my point. So helping companies optimize their value chain. That's basically what I've been doing over the last years. And we think at Camelot, we can no longer do that without making sustainability an integral element of this. And this is exactly where we're coming from. So how can we actually make sustainability hit the road, if you want so, in supply chains, in management decisions? That's our key focus. Yeah, and I think we really need to do that. Yeah, there's a clear case need for action, and we need to move in a direction where sustainability is really transforming business and is transforming global value chains. And I want to illustrate that a bit along these 4 themes. And let me start with a case for action, and I do it relatively quickly because I think it is so abundantly clear around climate change, right, that there is a strong need for action, and companies need to move faster than they're doing today. Yeah. I think you all know that. I love this cover of The Economist because it just shows the dynamic that's at play here. I think we're all seeing that the sense of urgency and awareness is increasing in the last few years. Yeah, of course, a little late because it's not a new topic, right? In terms of science and the science behind it's not new, but I think we see a lot of shift there now in business and society, which is good. And we also see, I think, a lot of activity, but it's of course still not enough. Yeah, and I think our key point is we see companies doing a lot in improving transparency on sustainability, launching initiatives, but it needs to be much deeper embedded into their operational reality. And that's, I think, a key starting point for us. Of course, for a company, if you imagine, and we not only work with the big global players, you have big headquarters and lots of staff, right? We also work with mid-sized companies. And I think this is really complex for companies, especially if I put myself in the shoes of a mid-sized company, right? There's so many dimensions of ESG, right? Environmental, social, and governance. It's not only about greenhouse gas, right? It's about pollution, water, it's about nitrogens, and we could have a much longer list, right? And alone getting the topic of greenhouse gas and CO2 emissions under control is already a big challenge. Yeah. And in addition, what I think makes it challenging that there are lots of moving targets and moving pieces. Yeah, regulation is changing all the time. Taxes, yeah, this triggers a lot of effort, administrative burden, yeah, but also technology. So it's all moving, and I know for sure that many companies are really struggling, especially the smaller and mid-sized companies, to get that well under control. Yeah, understandably, it's not easy. Yeah. And now if we really zoom in on climate change, which is somehow, at least in my view, one of the more pressing, I mean, they are all important topics within the ESG basket, so to say, but this is one of the very pressing topics. I think we're facing a massive challenge here, and I guess you've discussed that in this course, right? I mean, if you see the trajectory of global emissions here, and that's in gigatons of CO2 equivalents. Basically, if we look back, we see a trajectory that's going up, of course, fueled by different regions in the world, right? And we've been more going slightly down in the EU, but we see a trajectory that's been going at least slightly up. Perhaps 2020 has led to, I don't know, 6 to 7% less emissions, but that is by far not enough. So we now need to go on this glide path to zero, yeah? And that would be really a trend disruption of the current trend. And that needs a massive change in companies. And also, it's not just about doing just one thing, it's about doing many things on many different fronts. So changing behavior, resource efficiency and circularity, using renewables, using completely new technologies, right, which are perhaps too costly right now and need to be further developed. So doing that trend change and getting on this glide path to zero will be for many companies a huge transformation of their value chain and of their operating model. And what comes again to that, and which doesn't make it easier, and I'm not sure you discussed, I assume you discussed the scopes of CO2 here in that course. If not, let me just quickly say it. Basically, when you measure CO2 equivalence, you would do it according to the greenhouse gas protocol in 3 different scopes. So scope 1, if said simply, is basically fuels and energy you combust on your own assets. So you have a power plant as a company and you combust gas or coal, right? And this is a scope 1 emission. Scope 2 emissions is for all the electricity, but also in industrial complexes, it's a lot about steam and cooling and all the electricity and energy you purchase from the outside. And then you have scope 3, which is very important and very big, which is everything you outsource. These are sourced products and services. Yeah. And I think the key takeaway is here, if you look at the total carbon footprint of companies, scope 3 has, of course, a very large share. So with their own operations, companies only perhaps contribute to 20 to 25% of their footprint, sometimes even less. 70 to 90% of the footprint is outside, is with their suppliers. So that makes reducing it even more of a challenge, because it's not just about yourself within your own 4 walls, so to say, but it's about collaboration in your entire ecosystem of suppliers. Yeah, so that I just wanted to show a bit the need for action is clear. The challenge is also there. Yeah. But now we wanted to show you a bit more and illustrate a bit more concretely. So what does it really mean for a company? And I just now picked here as an example a pharma company to illustrate a bit. So what does this topic of carbon footprint look like from the perspective of a company? So we basically invented that company, or founded it as you want, right? It's Green Farm. It's of course fictitious, as you may have guessed from the name, and it's a pharmaceutical company, yeah, based in Europe. You see here on the right. I don't go through the whole cost structure. It's a company which makes $1 billion US of revenue. Yeah, they have a nice operating profit. You see they have 3,000 FTE, and they produce patent-protected drugs. Right? Medicine. Yeah. It's not important to go through all the other facts, yeah, but typically such a company, yeah, with 1 billion revenue, you typically would know a lot about that company, right? You have a supply chain department, so they know exactly what the value chain looks like. Yeah, so here we have the value chain. It's of course a bit simplified, but you have research and development standing really at the beginning of in the pharmaceutical industry. Then you have API production, so that's the active pharma ingredient. So that's the ingredient of the drug that gives you the effect in the body. You have manufacturing of pills, for example. You have distribution in different steps, and then you have sales and service. Yeah. And I think we would very well know in the company, so how many FTEs are working in which step of the value chain, which cost is where, right? I mean, that's just management. You manage the company and it's very transparent. Why? Because you have accounting rules, you have accounting departments, you have ERP systems which are basically perfected for tracking the financial impact, right? For every transaction that a company does. But now you can ask yourself, so what of that do we have about carbon emissions? And probably most easily said is you have very little. You have very little transparency to really understand, so where is the carbon footprint of such a company? So what's actually driving the carbon footprint? Yeah, and that's a bit the question, right? Many companies are facing. I think some big companies have that already quite well under control, but also more high level on a company level, right? Not really on a product level, very detailed. But that's important to understand. So it's a bit following the logic. You cannot manage what you do not measure, right? So you need to understand which part in your value chain is driving carbon emissions. Is it your sales force with all the buildings and facilities and all the events you do and the travel? Or is it your API production? Or is it your logistics? Yeah, that's really an important question to answer. Yeah. And that's not easy for many companies, and many companies don't have that transparency. Yeah, so now if we look at it, and of course we have our model. I mean, we do these types of carbon footprint exercises with companies. So we've done it in pharmaceuticals and chemicals, in retail as well. And that's what it now could look like, for example. And that is a realistic picture. Yeah. I need to get rid of these things. So, yeah. So what could it look like? So that company would have roughly 400,000 tons of CO2 as an end-to-end footprint, carbon footprint. Yeah. I'm not sure that number tells you a lot, but I think what's important to see is this is 70 to 80% of that is driven really by the value chain. So really going from production to sales and customer service. Yeah, that will be driving 70 to 80% of the emissions you can influence with your value chain strategy and design. Yeah, the remaining, let's say 20 to 25% are more administrative functions. Yeah, and in pharma, of course, R&D has many employees, has a lot of activity, is also very relevant. Yeah. And if you just look at manufacturing, so manufacturing would be around 50 to 60% of your total carbon emissions. I'm not going into the details, but of course we also know and we've simulated, so what are the big drivers here, but I go into that in the next step. Now, of course, it's important, and there's also a challenge, I think, in terms of judgment and awareness, right? So if I tell you it's they have 1 million of debt, you would immediately be able to say, okay, is that good? Is that bad? Is that high? Is that low? Right? But we often just lack kind of the understanding and background to size these carbon footprints. Yeah. So you see here our company Green Farm has a carbon footprint of 415,000 tons. And you see also these are real numbers from other, and 415 tons per $1 million revenue. Yeah, sorry, I should have added that. Yeah, and you see it's relatively comparable with other big pharmacos. Yeah, and if you look at it, the tons of CO2 equivalents per FTF per employee, it's roughly 140 tons per employee. And I'm not sure you know, like a person living in Germany would roughly have a carbon footprint of 11 tons, 10 to 11 tons per year. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So you see, that's a significant footprint per person, right? Per employee that company is generating. That's 10 times what you would generate as a private person. So just to give you a bit of a sense, so understanding these numbers, understanding this currency of carbon emissions and CO2 equivalents is important if you want to have companies kind of focusing on it and really minimizing it. Yeah. Of course, we've also looked at our green farm company and broken down a bit what are really the biggest emissions categories. And I think what you often see, it's very typical. The biggest is really sourced energy. So they are not an energy utility company. They source most of their energy for production. So that's very relevant. That's 16%. Yeah, they do very little own energy generation. And then you see again scope 3. So all the purchased materials and services, that's driving the bunch of their carbon footprint. So why is that important? Because they, as a kind of selling company, as a brand owner, right, or marketing authorization holder, they trigger all these carbon emissions by buying chemicals, by buying intermediates, by buying services, by buying whatever from other suppliers. Yeah, so they are in the end responsible, yeah, as well for that entire footprint. Good. So now that is the current state. So now what would that company need to do? And here we didn't do like a highly sophisticated science-based targets calculation, right? We just took the German government energy concept, right? And kind of the reduction steps they have in here until 2030, 40, 50. And I'm not the ultimate expert on this, but I think this is even a bit lagging behind the Paris Agreement, but I'm not fully sure. I think it's not fully in line with Paris. But that would mean they would need to go down from 415,000 tons to 270,000 tons. So reduce basically a third of their footprint by 2030. So now you can imagine that's not just a little small incremental thing. That's basically like making their entire manufacturing, entire logistics, and admin functions zero carbon. That's a huge change. That takes massive efforts, investments, and changing their business model. And now if you go even further, like what this German energy concept would say, so basically they need to take out 60% of their emissions by 2040, which is again the next level. Yeah. So just to illustrate a bit, so what does that mean from the perspective of a company? These are really massive changes that they need to achieve. Yeah. So, and that's also something we now work on with companies. So we call that path to net zero. Yeah. And but before we go to that, I wanted to show this little example, and perhaps you can also help me a bit, because I think we're a bit in a world of fuzzy definitions in this, right? It's not like law, it's not like tax law where everything is very clear. Well, perhaps halfway clear. This very fuzzy. So you hear, for example, things like companies say, I will become carbon neutral, or I become climate neutral. Others say, I become net zero. Well, nobody says zero, yeah. But we spent some time. We actually just discussed it yesterday with a colleague who made this analysis, and we just discussed it yesterday. In our view, carbon neutral is the most, let's say, forgiving standard. So carbon neutral basically just says, so either reduce your own emission. So for example, our green farm would make the manufacturing more efficient with renewable energy, as one example. But you don't need to do that. You can also just offset your emissions. And you could offset it with two different types of measures, I would say. So one is really greenhouse gas reduction initiatives. So you pay money for initiatives which build solar projects or plant trees, so which actually lead to a new activity which actually helps to take away carbon, yeah, or avoid carbon emissions. Yeah. But you could also just buy carbon credits, like for example, Tesla is issuing, for example, a lot of carbon credits because they produce electric cars, and they basically sell these carbon credits to other traditional car manufacturers who are not producing enough electric cars. And now you can already think, well, does that really help? So if the one company does something good and the other one buys a credit and they don't need to put in measures. Yeah, so that's a very relatively forgiving standard, the carbon neutral in our understanding. Then of course net zero, that is from our perspective more what we would need to aim at. So really making structural changes to our business model and value chain to reduce our own emissions. And nobody will be able to go to really zero carbon in a value chain. So then use offsetting to compensate the rest. Yeah. So that would be, here's just a small, if you have 10 fuel cars, right, you would, let's say you switch 5 of them to electric, you actually use green energy to drive with them, and the remaining 5 cars you would buy a carbon offset. Yeah. And zero carbon, I think you sometimes hear it, but it's very rare. Yeah. It's potentially even scientifically not even possible, yeah. But there may be some, for example, very self-sufficient buildings, right, which generate all the energy they need to sustain themselves. So that may exist in some small areas, yeah. But it's for a whole company, it's very rare. Yeah. So just to, because we think also it's important to be clear about definitions, because in all this communication there are so many different claims flying around. Yeah, so then what does a path to net zero then typically look like? And as you already see, so we call that path to net zero. So the key focus is really, and that's an important strategic choice for a company. So what can we do structurally to make our value chain more sustainable? Yeah, and we see different types of measures. We work with companies on measures. We call that big tickets. There are typically some big tickets, like changing the power generation system to combined heat and power, or just increasing the renewable energy share. So many companies are closing power purchase agreements with big wind farms, offshore wind farms. So that's one way to do that. Yeah. If you extend renewable energy, the companies need to extend also energy storage. Yeah, that's for example, they buy electric boilers to generate steam in factories. And you see there are a couple of topics. Supply chain optimization is also part of it, but also working with your suppliers and systematically raising the level of your suppliers, and there are different certificates you could use for that to reduce the carbon footprint here. And then there are some measures which are typically more supporting. They don't have such a high impact. Building standards, insulation is very important. Yeah, fuel cell vehicles, electric vehicles can play a good role, and of course also some admin measures around video conferencing, travel. Yeah, travel less, travel smarter, the different things. And then there are some innovative, more technology-oriented measures which would be a bit longer along the line, but you would actually need it to go then very deep down. For example, sequestration or carbon capture or green hydrogen usage. Yeah, so just to show, so I think this is an important strategic choice for companies. Yeah, there are a lot of investments and cost involved if you do that. Basically the target in mind is to go down as far as possible with structural changes in your supply chain, and then only offset the rest. Good. Some quick research. So because we're talking about pharma, the pharma industry. So what are these companies doing? You see, and these are real examples, right, of pharma cores. You see they do a lot of offsetting. I think reforestation plays a big role. Building standards is an important measure. Also some good moves to include climate-related ESG topics in employee incentives, carbon sinks, which can be also has a lot to do with reforestation, but then also using these resources, for example, for biofuel generation, electric fleets, right, for business car fleet, but also for vehicles, for example, in logistics and in production, shipment optimization. These are, they can also save some CO2. But then you see the big tickets are really recycling, so using more circular input materials for your products. There, I think there's a lot of opportunity there. That means also you need to include these principles very early in the product design. Many companies are working. Why doesn't this? So many companies are working on product redesign. So basically achieving the same functional outcome for patients with less input materials. So there's a lot about packaging redesign. There's a lot about saving material, for example, in inhalers. So there a lot can be done still in terms of just using less material while preserving the same function for patients. And then, of course, you see the big tickets are really around power generation, efficiency in the conventional power generation, a lot about recovery and just how you reuse certain heat. And then, of course, renewable energy and fueling your processes with renewable energy. Just to give a bit of an overview, I think there's a lot happening, and many companies are really trying to get towards net zero. Good. Then what we always do is, of course, and that's important for companies, there needs to be a balanced way forward, right? I mean, I'm not sure you discussed this concept of the abatement curve. Of course, of course you want to choose the carbon reduction measures first, which may also help you improve your profit, and there are actually a lot of them. So energy efficiency is a very prominent example. You use less energy to drive your machines in production, or you apply some smart flow meters in your headquarters so that you can need less energy for heating and lighting. You use less power, you use less CO2, you use less cost. So that's the best thing. So that's what's here our quadrant first choice. But companies won't get to the target through the finish line just with things where they save cost. There will be topics like green power generation, new technologies like hydrogen, which also will take investments and cost. So that's an important topic where we work with companies on how can we balance that in a good way. Because it doesn't help if we become very sustainable, but then the company fails on the road. So far on, I hope that example was helpful to illustrate a bit. So from transparency to action, right? What does it really take, and what are perhaps the challenges for a company? Now I just want to have two more thoughts for you. So one is really technology and digitization can really play a major role in making value chains more sustainable. And that can be different things. So we see basically, I mean, we already discussed about transparency, helping companies better measure their carbon emissions. So data and analytics can help a lot with that. Helping companies optimally configure their supply chains, optimally plan their supply chains so that they drive less kilometers, that they use the most CO2 efficient factory to produce a product. You can imagine these are complex global value chains. By optimizing that with data, you can not only help save money, you can also actually help reduce the CO2 a lot. And then, of course, you need new processes if companies need to move to new business models. So, for example, if you're an equipment manufacturer for construction, I don't know, different tractors, or I'm not the expert in that actually. And today you're selling them, but you want to move, let's say, a part of your business to renting these products. So then you need completely new business processes. You certainly need to have rental contracts for a certain of time. Then you need to kind of get back these rental objects and refurbish them and maintain them and rent them out again. So you can imagine for companies, that's a big change, which needs kind of all the transaction systems and the digital processes in the background. So that's a hugely important enabler. And basically 2 key trends we see there, to keep it short, is basically we see more and more enterprise systems integrating carbon emissions. So that starts with product lifecycle management systems, where companies plan their products or the development stage, so to say, right? Like SimCenter, for example, that's a product lifecycle management system, but also ERP system. And the most notable is really SAP, starting to integrate carbon emissions as a kind of, as they call it, a green line linked to all of their transactions. That's a big important change, I think, and trend that's happening now. It's starting now, right? It's relatively late, but I think it's starting now, and it's still a long way to go. And that means also we need to invest more in data exchange between companies, because if you know a bit this carbon footprinting, today this is a project business. So you hire a consultancy and they do a carbon footprint for you, or they do a life cycle assessment, a third party. But it needs to become more automated, right? And for that, we need to go more to ecosystem approaches, perhaps using blockchain to exchange all these carbon data between companies so that it can be done in a more automated and a more granular way. Yeah. Because in the future, and many big companies are already working on that, we need to go from a company level carbon footprint to a product level carbon footprint, so that you will be able to say, this piece I produced has a carbon track record of X. Yeah. And that's a big step, and we're not there yet at all. Quick info, I mean, you can also Google it. I don't want to go too much in detail. SAP Climate 21. It's an initiative they launched last year. So basically enabling companies to move to a product level automated carbon footprinting approach that will be a big game changer if that becomes more common with companies. Yeah. And the main principle is, in the same way today you track the cost of an item or of a transaction, they want to track with it the CO2 footprint, yeah, of an item or transaction. And then what we find also interesting, not only because we're also active in the area of blockchain as Camelot, is blockchain is being used more and more also in the area of climate, action. So for example, tracking climate mitigation actions. So it's called monitoring and verification processes. So you use blockchain to track that. For example, are you achieving the certain reforestation you have promised in a certain project, which will then trigger certain credits? Yeah, or also in climate finance, which is a very important area, which kind of this whole climate finance, also blockchain is supporting that a lot. So there will be, I think, a lot more to come there in terms of blockchain, because we need to establish more this multi-party network and ecosystems where companies exchange on sustainability impacts, of products, of initiatives. That's today, that's not yet there, and that makes it very difficult to get this full transparency, including the scope 3, which you saw at the beginning is for companies 80% of the footprint. Yeah. So technology, I think, is a very exciting time for that, and a lot happening there. Yeah, and my last point is really, when we discuss sustainability, we come always from the, okay, what is it we want to improve? So for example, how much CO2 is triggered there? What's driving that? What's the initiative we need for that? But we think that's not sufficient in itself. So we think we change a bit the way we look at ESG, that we instead of looking at it from a portfolio of initiatives or a function like ESG as a function in a company, we look at it as a really central principle of management and decision making. So basically, what are the management processes and decision making processes which actually trigger carbon emissions? Yeah. And that's, from our view, an important perspective to take. And you see that in our article, we have kind of, you can see that on our blog. But basically, what are the key messages here? So we think companies need more than just the aspirational sustainability agenda, where they say, this is our path to neutral, these are our initiatives. They need to really go towards sustainable management. So basically saying, what are the core processes where we take decisions which are critical to our ESG impact or societal impact? Yeah. What are the enforcement mechanisms we use to really integrate sustainability in these processes? Yeah, and how do we measure it with KPI systems? Yeah, and we also need to embed that in the organization. So these are points which trigger a lot of change in companies. Yeah. So what does it mean? So this is not like a highly scientific analysis. It's more based on our experience. So we think if you really look at strategic management processes, there are 5 processes which would, I would say, lock in more than 80% of a company's emissions. Yeah, it's first of all, it's their business canvas. So that's developing new projects, new products, and their strategy. Yeah, and deciding what type of products are they investing in. Yeah, it's their strategic portfolio planning, where they really say, how much marketing budget do I give to which business unit or which product group, right? And how much R&D do I put into which area? It's CapEx planning, yeah. So where they decide, so which capital investments will we take? And of course, how they design their supply networks and how they select their suppliers, yeah, and manage their suppliers. Yeah. So we would say these 5 are really important management processes. And if we really want to get quick impact on CO2 and climate change, we need to make sure that these aspects are integrated in each one of these processes, because they will make the difference in the end. And you don't need to read all that. You can read it in the article. We think we need to educate people in companies, especially in certain critical functions. And I think finance plays a key role here. Yeah. And we need to build some capability. For example, if I just take 2 examples, so the strategic planning and portfolio management, right? There are already methodologies. So one is called portfolio sustainability assessment, where companies, and for example, Clariant is doing that, and BASF, so big chemical players are doing that very well already, where they basically in their strategic business plan say, so what share of our business should be driven from sustainable products, very sustainable products, medium products, and which is still with not so sustainable products. That needs to be planned. And if companies don't make sure that they invest today, be it marketing budget, R&D budget, in the sustainable parts of the business, right, then I think it will be hard to get a turnaround in the next years. So because if you keep investing in the traditional parts, you will never make the shift. Yeah, and something similar you have in CapEx planning. So I think it's fair to say the big change needs to come now in the next 3 to 5 years in terms of capital investment. So if the capital investment portfolios of companies are not changing in the next 3 years, we will not be able to meet the targets until 2030. So that means companies have capital investment appraisal processes. They need to have much more visibility there on climate impact. Yeah, and that is possible. This is all not rocket science, but for companies, it's a change. You need expertise, you need resources for that, but it's just an important change we want to highlight. Yeah. Good, and the same is for metrics. I don't go through the details here now, so let me move on. So just my last page is, so what do we do at Camelot? So I mentioned we do sustainable consulting, right? So 3 key pillars. So we do help companies how to improve their sustainability strategy. Yeah, that are also to do with their operating model, and many different aspects. Of course, a core area for us is making the value chain more sustainable. So we work on emission neutral manufacturing, circular economy projects, procurement. Procurement is controlling the scope 3, how to improve that and make sure your suppliers are contributing. And of course, also developing solutions. Remember the role of digitization and technology, right, to help companies get better transparency and optimize their supply chain, not only for cost, but also for a better carbon footprint. Good. So I don't see a clock, so I don't know whether I'm in time or out of time. Yeah, okay, then we're now, I think, open for questions. And here we just put some questions. These were more our questions we have in mind, but please ask your questions.
Let me take a second to read the questions. Thank you so much, Thomas and Kathleen. I really enjoyed the talk. I will